Kay Goody and Chris Nagano.
I'm Endangered Species Division Chief. I work at the Sacramento Field Office.
Okay.
I guess if I'd like to say one thing before you ask questions, that's okay. A bit about the history of the listing of the Calliope silver spot. There was a listing action that went on in the late 70s and 80s that I believe it was Michelle or someone here who might have briefly mentioned. But the action that occurred where we listed the Calliope as an endangered species came about in the early 1990s, and it was as a result of a investigation that our office and our law enforcement division led, where through a variety of sources we found out that there were people, a person, poaching Calliope silver spots, not just from San Bruno Mountain, but through some other intelligence or other sources. They were poaching from the other large population in the Cordelia Hills of Solano County. In fact, one of the guys who went to prison had literally hundreds of Calliope silver spots that he had collected and killed from San Bruno Mountain. He had collected them from along the PG&E right away on the southeast ridge. So the reason why we listed Calliope was not because we had concluded or felt that the HCP was not working or was a failure, but it was because of what we found was a serious threat of poaching. It was a worldwide investigation. A couple people went to jail. We seized literally thousands of butterflies, endangered species, and also butterflies out of national parks as a result of that case. As Kay mentioned earlier, what we're concerned about is the loss of habitat on San Bruno Mountain due to invasive plants. This was fully analyzed in our biological opinion and our NEPA documents, which I believe you have copies of, so I won't go into detail. But about 122 acres of grassland within the conserved habitat was lost between, I believe it was 82 and 2004. As far as the movement issues of the Calliope go, based on studies of silver spots, including another Spiraea dahlia, which is called the regal silver spot. They are strong flyers. The genus as a whole, they're powerful flyers, but they do move around, and you know, they will move through urban areas. They'll fly between houses. They fly across streets. They fly over coastal scrubs. So, like I said, what we're concerned about is the loss of habitat for the Calliope due to invasives. And there was mention made of the inadequacy of the study that Bob Langston had done in the 80s and early 90s. But I think even Travis's, Dr. Longcore's report stated that does show relative distribution of the butterfly over time, and I don't recall Tom Reed's specific comment, but I think it's important to remember that the Calliope, like a lot of insects, is what's called an R-selected species, in which they produce large numbers of offspring, a lot of eggs, and there's a low survival rate, which I think someone might have mentioned earlier. They're not like what we call K species, which is where you have few offspring and you live a long time. So the numbers of R-selected species like Calliope will go up and down, sometimes very dramatically, and so it's important to look at where the observations were distributed on the mountain.
And the only other mention that I would like to clarify is the Fish and Wildlife Service is not sending out. I'm in charge of both the recovery planning and the habitat conservation planning in the Sacramento field office. There's no recovery plan that's coming out in the next few months. What had been done recently was a 5-year review, which is a status review of the species. It was published, I think, in August of this year. It is available, and basically it assembles all the recent data and information over the 5-year period, and we, of course, use that in our analysis.
Thank you. Ready for some questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Fire away.
Thank you for coming, and thank you to all of you in the audience, and also the emails and the letters that you've sent in. You're here tonight because you care about Brisbane, you care about the environment, and having people come and engage is part of the public process. So thank you for that. On page 3 of this report, it says the HCP was designed as a long-term.
You're referring to what document?
The LSA
Oh, okay.
document, that the HCP was designed as a long-term program for conserving the ecology of San Bruno Mountain.
Fish and wildlife.
So
We'd have to have Judy come up and address that if it's the LSA document.
well, I mean, it's a question about the HCP. So, I mean,
Okay.
in regards to conserving the ecology of San Bruno Mountain, up to this date right now, what kind of letter grade would you give the plan? And if additional funding was provided, what difference that would make?
Well, the first thing is that the service had provided numerous comments early on, even in the 90s, where we were concerned about some of how the management and the lack of funding and trying to work on dealing with the plan. Of course, this was, there is no vested interest to making sure a habitat conservation plan stays in place from the Fish and Wildlife Service, other than we want to have a good conservation plan to occur for the species. So just because it's the first HCP doesn't mean that you accept it and in all its glory or woes. And it should be clear that we've learned a lot of information from the first HCP that was done to the ones that have done to date. Very different documents. So I wouldn't necessarily give it a grade, I think, in the sense that there was a number of things that we wouldn't do today that was done in the 80s, but there's a lot of things I wouldn't wear that I wore in the 80s that I, today.
Sure.
So, I mean, you learn a lot from what has gone on, the mistakes that have been made. I do think that that we've been very careful to look at the plan and to see, it is true that we worked very hard and pushed very hard to reduce the level of development from this project and to provide the funding that is needed. It's very important to understand the premise of the Endangered Species Act is we don't stop. We're not stopping development. It's to authorize and to permit and to evaluate a project. You don't. The only way you can ever actually say no perfectly is to have a jeopardy biological opinion or a no permit, and that's very rarely done. So, I mean, I think that we would not have issued the permit if we didn't feel confident that it was appropriate at this point. Do you have anything to add?
No, I agree with that. That in our evaluation, that this amendment is not a jeopardy. In fact, because of the removal and management and control of invasives, that it will help the survival and recovery of the butterflies on San Bruno Mountain.
And then I like to point out that, like, even on the monitoring kinds of things that we learned is that we did talk about fixing the transects and